You never forget the ones who notice you when the world looks away. That's what makes this tale so powerful. It starts on a languid, scorching summer afternoon in a small American town, the kind of place where time is a little more elastic, where neighbors still wave from the porches, and where you know every face at the diner. His name was Rob Jenkins, a black server with a silver smile and a weary spine, a man who was an expert at serving more than just a meal. He served peace, presence, and something that most people didn't realize that they were famished for: kindness. He wasn't wealthy, and he didn't live extravagantly, but he possessed something all too rare: a quiet, generous heart that caused strangers to feel like home. It was one sweltering day in 2005 that two dusty, wordless children stumbled into Miller's diner. No shoes, no smiles, shadows in their eyes alone. Rob did not inquire about why they were there without a parent. He did not judge. He just served them grilled cheese, fries, and two tall glasses of chocolate milk. "Eat up," he murmured. "It's my treat." With that single action, he unknowingly re-scripted the journey of two young lives. They returned the following day, and the day after that, still silent, still reserved, but gradually coming around. Rob never asked for a tale, and they never provided one. But in that small gesture, scrambled eggs for overlooked children, something significant gained traction. And then, just as mysteriously as they appeared, they vanished. No farewell, no message, just disappeared. Rob didn't pursue it. He'd grown up wondering himself, raised by a grandmother who taught him to give without getting. Even so, he never forgot them. Years went by, seasons flipped. Rob remained behind that diner counter, doing what he'd always done, making people feel noticed. Until one morning, 20 years later, a noise shattered the quiet of his front porch. A low, thumping rumble in the air. A helicopter, not only flying above, but landing right there, across the street. Neighbors emerged from their homes. Curtains were pulled back, and then, out of the dust and whirling blades, two adults stepped down. A man and a woman, dressed to the nines, walking proudly. But their eyes contained something soft, something familiar. Rob's heart was stuck in his chest. "Can I help you?" he called out, still uncertain. The man took a step forward and smiled. "You already did, 20 years ago." What followed would render a whole town speechless, because this was not a reunion, it was a revelation. The boy Rob had once fed up was now a surgeon. The girl, now a prosperous tech founder who assists homeless youth. And they hadn't come just to thank him. They arrived bearing a gift, a retirement, a lakefront dream house, and a moment so filled with thankfulness that even the hardest hearts cracked with tears. Because of it, 20 years ago, one man made the choice to be compassionate instead of convenient. He gave from what little he had, without realizing that one small act could ripple so far. It makes you think, how many lives have we crossed paths with, without realizing the significance of our touch in their narrative? How frequently do we undervalue the impact of a meal, a gentle word, a listening ear? Sometimes the most mundane moment is the fulcrum upon which someone's life shifts, and sometimes it comes back to haunt you when you are not looking. In a world that sometimes seems to get louder and faster, Rob's tale is a whispered reminder that goodness still counts, that it resounds, that even the smallest act of kindness, freely given and with no strings attached, can be the springboard for someone else's victory. So stay with this tale for a while. Have it thaw the still places of your heart, and wonder, would you take it if you were given the opportunity to give someone a moment of dignity? Because you don't know who's eating off your table, or how far kindness is going to reach. Now, let's revisit to the start. You can never predict when one small kind act can change everything. It was summer 2005 in a sleepy southern town, and the sun pounded down fiercely on Main Street, heating the sidewalks until they glistened in the bright afternoon light. The air was cool inside Miller's diner, with the sweet scent of fresh biscuits and coffee. Robert Jenkins, just Rob, to anyone who'd ever occupied one of those crimson vinyl booths, worked back of the counter, wiping it down with smooth familiarity. 15 years at the diner, not out of a desire for the paycheck, although it wasn't hurting, but because he enjoyed the cadence, the rattle of plates, the clockwork regular, the way people unfolded over a slice of pie. The people adored Rob. He had this knack, always knew what your order was, inquired after your grandkids, blinked at you if you were having one of those down days. But on this specific afternoon, something unusual occurred that would stay with Rob the rest of his life. The front door had its characteristic squeak, and two children entered. They couldn't have been older than 7 and 10. A girl and a boy. Their clothes were rumpled, dusty, and hung a tad too large. They had no shoes on, and their little faces wore an expression Rob knew: apprehension, perhaps even fear, but tinged with something more muted: hunger. The boy preceded the girl, grasping her hand, and they slid into the back booth as if hoping to go unnoticed. They grabbed the menus, gazed at them without so much as turning a page. Rob stopped mid-wipe and stared at them for a second. The way they sat, shoulders together, eyes flicking, said more than anything else would have. They weren't here with somebody. They weren't just passing through, and they sure as hell hadn't eaten in a while. Rob didn't yell across the room. He didn't draw attention. He just went into the kitchen, said a few gentle words to the cook, and returned with 2 warm plates: grilled cheese sandwich, golden and gooey, crunchy fries with just the right amount of salt, and big glasses of chocolate milk. He put the plates down softly in front of them, bent low enough so that they could hear what he was saying without feeling watched. "You kids okay?" he asked, his voice gentle and friendly. The little girl nodded carefully, but her eyes were rimmed with red like she'd cried earlier, before they arrived. Rob looked over at the boy. "Your folks around?" he said quietly, not attempting to pry, just worried. No response this time. The boy left his eyes lowered, jiggling the edge of the napkin. Rob caught enough to realize he wasn't going to get any today, and that suited him fine. "You just needed room sometimes." He smiled, tapped the table gently, and said, "Eat up, my treat." The children glanced up, shocked, not with words but with their eyes. The kind of surprise that comes when you're used to hearing no, or go away, and suddenly someone says yes, without asking for anything in return. Rob walked back to the counter, but he kept an eye on them. The boy picked up the sandwich like it was made of gold. She sipped the chocolate milk, closed her eyes, and for an instant, all the burden on her little shoulders seemed to disappear. They dined slowly, as if they did not want it to be over too quickly. Rob said nothing about it. Not the cook, not the waitress who worked that shift. He did not report it on social media or request gratitude. That was not in his nature. He simply observed them eating and ensured they were fine until they crept away an hour later. No greetings, no names, just 2 children who had been outside sweating and discovered a pinch of kindness at the end of a red booth. When they were gone, Rob tidied up the table, swept the crumbs, and went back to his normal routine, as if today were like any other. But something inside him changed. Perhaps it was the way the girl regarded him when he delivered the food. Or perhaps it was the boy's silence, one that speaks louder than words. Rob had lived with little himself, raised by his grandmother after his parents died. When he was still a teenager, he knew what it felt like to do without. He also understood the strength of a hot meal. When your belly's been too long, unreplenished. That day lingered with him, not because he believed he'd done anything remarkable, but because in his own heart, he wished those kids got to something better. He never saw them again. Days went by, then weeks, then years. But occasionally when the diner quieted down and the afternoon sun caught just so, Rob would look at that worn corner booth, and for a couple of seconds, he'd see them again, barefoot and starved, but safe. And down inside, he'd ask himself whatever happened to those 2 little strangers who showed up on a sweltering summer afternoon and departed with full bellies and a little more hope than they arrived with. Rob never said a word to anyone about the children. Not the cook in the rear, not the waitress with the gaudy earring, not even Miss Darlene, the town librarian, who brought him banana bread every Friday. He just kept that memory stored unobtrusively in his heart, like an old picture that you don't display but won't forget. To Rob it was no big deal, just something you did. The manner in which you held the door for someone behind you, the manner in which you assisted your neighbor with grocery in the rain, the manner in which you smiled at the lonely people who came to the diner as much for the talk as they did for coffee. He did not consider himself a hero. He was merely a man who practiced doing the right thing, even when there was no one to witness it. But in the back of his mind, the truth was, Rob knew more than anyone could have imagined. He'd been taken in by his grandmother after life claimed his parents too soon. He lived in a tiny shotgun house with paper-thin walls and a roof that leaked. There were more evenings than he could count when dinner consisted of buttered toast and hope. But his grandmother, Miss Lottie, never let him forget that whatever little they did have, it was shared. Never shut your door to a hungry person, she'd say, because you never know when you'll be the one knocking on it. That was something that stuck with Rob all his life. And so when two kids walked into the diner that morning, he saw himself in them. Not their faces or their tale, but their quiet hunger, their cautious silence, the way they didn't ask for anything, as if they were afraid someone would say no. And something more surprising still happened. The very next morning, shortly after sunrise, these same children appeared. The bell above the diner door rang softly, and there they were, same booth, same wide eyes, same uncertain faces. Rob welcomed them with a smile, already cracking eggs on the griddle, pancakes with blueberries that morning, the kind that just melted in your mouth. And nothing, of course, was mentioned about their circumstances. He just fed them, discussed cartoons, asked if they liked school, even though he doubted they had been in a classroom for some time. They hardly spoke at all, but the little girl began to smile more. The boy sat slightly straighter. Rob didn't push them for information. He just ensured they had something to eat in front of them, and a spot where they felt safe. And they returned again and again, day after day, a whole week long. One day he served them soup and grilled cornbread. Another day, he prepared banana pudding and sent them off with small to-go cups covered in napkins. He offered them kindness, never asking for anything back. No names, no histories, no vows. He did not attempt to be savior. He simply gave what he was able: warmth, sustenance, and a moment of tranquility in a world that had apparently not been very good to them. But on the 8th day, they did not arrive, nor on the next, nor the one after that. They were just nowhere. Like the summer storm that comes on, stirs your heart, and vanishes before you've even caught your breath. Rob kept glancing towards that booth every morning, hoping perhaps they'd come walking back through the door. But they never did. No note, no farewell, just nothing. And that nothing rang louder than words ever had. It wasn't disappointment he felt, not really. More of a persistent ache, the sort that is present in the background of your life. He had no idea where they went, whether they were taken in, or if things improved or worsened. But he hoped, oh he so hoped, that somewhere in the world they found safety, love, and possibly even the sort of home they never knew before. Life, of course, has its own tendency to go on. The diner remained active. Morning coffee crowds, lunch rushes, high school students demanding extra fries. Seasons passed, new servers drifted through, the wallpaper changed, but Miller's Diner remained a mainstay of the town. And Rob, he just kept on doing what he did before. Arrived early, left late, listened more than he taught, never sought praise, never required it. But now and then, particularly on those languid afternoons, when the light streamed through the windows, just so, and the air was charged with memory, Rob would catch himself looking over at that tacky old corner booth. The vinyl booth had a tiny rip now, and the wood along the window had paled with age. But in his imagination, he could still see them. The kid clutching his sister's hand, the girl drinking her chocolate milk, that guarded optimism in their eyes, the kind that can only grow when someone gives you a little mercy, in a world too hard on the young and the silent. He'd sit with his coffee cup, looking at the door involuntarily, contemplating how individuals enter your world sometimes, for a brief second, but leave something that remains perpetually. Rob wasn't sure if he'd ever lay eyes on those children again. Honestly, he doubted it. But still, a part of him wished, hoped they recalled the smell of pancakes, the sweetness of chocolate milk, and the gentleness of a man who didn't inquire about their story, but offered them a seat at the table, in any case. Because that is who Rob was, a man with quiet heart, steady hands, and plain wisdom, the kind the world doesn't always see, but is in desperate need of. 20 years flew by, like pages in a worn-up photo album. Quietly, steadily, and without permission, Rob Jenkins,
The young smiling center of Miller's Diner was now on the verge of retirement. His back hurt a little more each morning, and his knees complained softly when he stooped to tie his shoe. But his spirit remained strong. His dark hair was speckled with silver now, and the lines on his face from smiling had etched themselves deeper with age. Not sadness, but from years of being kind and of sharing daily stories that made life worth living. The town came and went around him. Stores closed and reopened. Houses filled and emptied. But Miller's Diner remained, a sturdy old oak everyone knew they could lean against. Rob had turned himself into a legend in town, not for seeking fame, but because his warmth never falters. Over the years, he'd coached half of the town's teenagers on how to pour coffee without dropping it, how to smile at the regulars, and how to always listen more than they spoke. He'd given subtle advice to young people with ambitions too large for a small town, dispensed extra pie slices to old-timers who had little and had somehow kept track of every birthday of every customer to step into the diner in more than 2 decades. But even for a man as earthy as Rob, time has a tendency to slow a man down. Retirement hadn't intimidated him, just odd to think of mornings without the soft clinking of coffee cups or the scent of bacon cooking on the griddle. On one warm spring morning, Rob sat on the same old porch swing where he'd been sitting since the 90s, cradling a cup of tea rather than coffee. These days, doctor's orders. The air was quiet, the wind was soft, and the birds sang their familiar happy song from the maple tree in front. It was that kind of day that whispered peace. He gazed out at the sleeping street, the cracks in the sidewalk he knew by heart, and the neighbors he had watched grow from children to parents themselves. But then, slicing through that serenity, with a harsh rhythmic sound, whomp whomp, something so out of place in the peaceful town, it shook the leaves and sent birds flying. Rob narrowed his eyes towards the sky, squinting away the sunlight. It was a helicopter, large, expeditious, unplanned. He wondered momentarily if perhaps it was medical, bound for the city hospital 2 towns away. But rather than roaring off, the helicopter started to descend, then slow, over the vacant field, directly in front of Rob's house, a field that stood empty after the warehouse there burned years before. Dust swirled in circles, grass flattened, and curtains along the entire street flew open as the neighbors leaned out their windows and peeked from behind blinds. No one in this town ever saw helicopters, much less one landing in their street. Rob got up slowly, his mug shaking a little in his hand, heart beating an extra beat. The rotor-borne wind stirs the flags on the porch and ruffled his thinning locks as the helicopter landed softly, engines purring with soft power. And then out came 2 individuals. A young man wearing a dark suit, tall and confident, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. His shoes were shiny, his stride confident, and standing next to him was a woman graceful, poised with warm eyes and a smile that spoke volumes. They looked out of place, yet utterly sure of where they were. Rob stood stock still on his porch, still not quite believing his eyes. Were they politicians, journalists, movie stars? Then the 2 began walking, not towards the neighbors, or the mayor's house, or the sheriff's office, but directly toward him. Rob put his mug down on the railing, stood up straighter, attempted to straighten the front of his worn cardigan. He looked back over his shoulder, half expecting someone else to be the target audience. But no question. They were driving directly to his front gate. The man halted a few feet from the porch and grinned. Rob, his heart pounding in his ears, was able to speak up. "Can I help you?" he bellowed, not ungraciously, but quite more than a little perplexed. The man glanced at the woman next to him, then took a step forward, hesitating, as if the situation called for more than an instant response. And then his voice rocked steady with emotion. He replied in a way that caused Rob's knees to weaken almost to the point of collapse. "You already did, 20 years ago." Something shifted in Rob's memory. In that moment, something far away, but not forgotten. The suit, the eyes, the grace memory. Something shifted in Rob's memory, in that forgotten. The suit, the eyes, the grace, and then without warning, The years unwound like a movie reel, and Rob found two small faces at the corner booth. Barefoot, dusty, hungry, and now, standing before him grown up. His breath hitched, his throat constricted, and the world skewed just a little bit. He didn't know their names. His breath hitched, his throat constricted, and the world skewed just a little bit. He didn't know their names. He didn't know where life had led them. But he knew for certain that these were the children from that sweltering summer day. The boy who never spoke much. The girl with red-rimmed eyes spoke much. The girl with red-rimmed eyes. The ones he fed without questioning. The ones he had always questioned. At night, when the diner closed, and the quietness descended, and now they stood before him, no longer lost, no longer small, smiling, thankful. And with them, something Rob had never in a million years anticipated. Closure, happiness, and the start of something he couldn't even identify yet. Rob gazed at the young men, his head trying to keep up with what his heart already understood. He blinked once, and then again his breath suspended somewhere between memory and incredulity. The steep angle of the man's jaw, the eyes with their calm resolve. The steep angle of the man's jaw, the eyes with their calm resolve. The small, shy smile. Something in all of this rang hauntingly, and then it struck him, as if a gentle shock through the years. Everything came back, in a rush. The eyes, the smile. The boy from the hot summer so many years ago, sitting in the back booth of the diner, hardly taking a bite out of the diner, hardly taking a bite out of his grilled cheese sandwich. And now on his porch in a suit, proud but unassuming, was that boy grown up. Rob's voice was hardly more than a breath. Rob's voice was hardly more than a breath. No way. The young man shook his head, a blend of pride and feeling in his face. You gave us food when nobody pride and feeling his face. You gave us food when nobody else would, he said softly. You just gave us food and calm. Next to him, the woman moved forward. She wore a quiet elegance, dressed plain but with dignity. Her voice firm in spite of the dignity. Her voice firm in spite of the tears glistening in her eyes. In spite of the tears glistening in her eyes. You made us feel human again, she said. Her voice weighed down with remembrance. Like we counted. Rob slowly opened the screen door, still in awe, and invited them inside. His hands shook ever so slightly, not from age, but from the heavy load of the moment. Inside, they sat around his old kitchen table. The one with the faint coffee ring stains and under the one with the faint coffee ring stains and uneven rings. The walls were still covered with faded family photos.
Postcards from friends long gone, and a clock that ticked a bit too loud in the silence. But in that moment, the house felt full, not just with people, but with meaning. They sat for hours, sipping tea and wedges of pie Rob had made the previous day, and gradually, as a puzzle piece fell into place after 2 long decades, the tale unfolded. The boy was now Dr. Marcus Taylor, a thriving trauma surgeon based in Atlanta. The little girl, now Elena, grew up to be a technology entrepreneur, owning a company that developed nonprofit software, and a vocal activist for foster children. Their path had not been a smooth one. After that last morning at the diner, they were taken by child service. They were placed in a foster home in a different county by a local family who was not rich, but had a good heart. The path that ensued had its highs, schools that had no idea, nights of doubt. But throughout they clung to one thing, that week at Miller's Diner, the hot food, the soft talk, the quiet respect Rob had shown them when the world had treated them like phantoms. That memory, Elena said, was an anchor, a reminder that there was still kindness in the world, that they were not invisible, and that one day, perhaps, they'd be strong enough to pay her back. We looked for you for years, she told him, her fingers running around the rim of the mug Rob had brought her. We didn't know your name. All we knew was Rob. We had to sift through ancient city records, news articles, even an alumni site from a waitress tracked down on Facebook. She smiled gently, but we never gave up. Rob leaned back in his chair, slowly shaking his head, still attempting to come to terms with the moment. I'm just a guy who made sandwiches, he said, his voice warm. Didn't think I was making a difference. But Marcus stood up for table, slowly and with quiet intent, moving to stand beside the man who had unwittingly altered trajectory. No, he said, you were our first indication that the world still contained kindness, that we weren't forgotten, that we counted. He stopped, glancing around the kitchen, the yellowed walls, the scratched counters, the warmth that filled every inch. You gave us hope we didn't even know what that was. Rob swallowed hard, feeling his chest swell up with all those years not knowing what happened, all those quiet minutes sitting over at the booth at the diner, wondering where life, and now, Here they were, strong and successful, full of grace, and standing in his house not only recalled, he couldn't keep the tears at bay, and not because he was bitter, but because the secret that had resided unseen in his heart 2 decades had at last come back, not as a question, but as a blessing. For Rob, who had devoted his life to never once asking for something, this was almost too much to process. It wasn't about praise, it wasn't about ego, it was about connection. The sort that exists outside of time, outside of word, and return you least anticipate. That morning, hunched over in the kitchen, Rob didn't feel he didn't feel weary. He felt complete with purpose, complete with peace, and full of thankfulness that something he'd done without hesitation had sown seeds that blossomed greater. 2 weeks after that unforgettable, the entire town of Maple came to Rob Jenkins' retirement celebration. It was a community gathering filled with laughter and a shared sense of respect. Spent his life serving quiet. Miller's Diner had never been every booth filled, every church hall chair borrowed for church, and standing room only at the back were people just to catch it. Balloons hovered above the faded picture of Rob, him flipping pan, handing a milkshake child, sitting next to regular sparkle. There were smiles, but tears too, happy, thankful. Teacher, trucker, grocery, even the mayor all could tell them. A woman in her 60s spoke about how Rob once, a retired mechanic called Rob. Young adults who once bussed tables spoke about how Rob's kind and confident. Every person seemed to carry a piece of Rob's legacy. He sat at a table in his Sunday best, a bit dazed, quiet. He never enjoyed, but this was different. This was not attention. This was appreciation. And it was about, as the laughter died down and the music faded, two familiar faces stepped up. Marcus. The room fell silent, all eyes on the now, whose homecoming awoken. Marcus stood ramrod straight in his black, his voice unshaken. We owe our lives, his pause. Now it's our turn. For an instant, silent, a kind that doesn't come along often, and envelops. Elena walked, clutching small black. She opened it to shiny, but simple, yet they handed it to Rob, who blinked. This Marcus isn't just parked. Light laughter, it's the key to fully paid off. Right on Lake. It's peaceful, it's quiet, and it's forever. For a moment, Rob, he couldn't. His hand trembled, looking from, then out at the sea of smiling tears. A home? He finally, his voice cracked. By the Elena nodded, her voice soft, proud. We asked around. Turns out, you'd always dreamed, watching this, perhaps even, we ensured it has a front, and ample. The room was filled with cheers, even some clapped some, but no one. Rob stood cradling as if it were made of. I don't know what, voice full of him. I never did any, but Marcus, you fed us, you treated us, you gave us a place. That doesn't sound, but to Elena said, this is taking. And then someone yelled, what about that? Some more. Rob raised a smiling, still can't get. Elena smiled. Well, we wanted to make sure. The crowd chuckled, but under the something. This wasn't merely, it was the gift of 20 years. It was evident goodness creates, even when. Later that same afternoon, a small trailed was new, and there it was, under over wide, white shutter, and a view that extended. It was, and for the first time in decades, Rob was standing, that wasn't weathered and creaky. This one was new, a start, and not a finish. The sun beginning to set over the trees. He sat in a rocking chair, the wind blowing cool against his face as he gazed out over the lake. And in that still moment, with the soft slap of water against the dock, Rob Jenkins smiled, not because he had a new house or because 2 children he once gave a meal to had returned in the most lovely way, but because he finally understood that his life had counted, not in great deeds or front-page news, but in small kindnesses. Through chocolate milk and grilled cheese, with warm smiles and steady hands. Down case. And that ultimately was the greatest gift of all. At other times, the greatest impact comes from a small act of kindness. Rob never did anything with an end in mind. He didn't sit down and think about how to transform someone's life. He didn't seek reward or recognition. He didn't anticipate applause. He just saw 2 hungry children and decided to share what he had: a hot meal, a warm place to sit, and the kind of quiet respect the world too often forgets to bestow upon those in need. It wasn't big, it wasn't boisterous, but it was powerful. And in that moment, without realizing, Rob planted a seed that would take root in the hearts of 2 children who had all but lost hope for being noticed. In a world where human beings bustle past each other, stuck in time and distracted by sound, Rob took time, he saw, he cared. and it changed everything. His compassion was a memory that never lost its force. With Marcus and Elena, it made him a reason to continue, to trust people once more, and eventually, to be the type of people who would return it 10 times over. Rob didn't possess much. He was poor, and he never sought fame, but he had a big heart and an unshakable spirit. And sometimes that's better than anything gold can hold. We live in a time where it's easy to be skeptical, where people question motive, and where simple good deeds are often overlooked or taken for granted. But stories like Rob's remind us that the quiet moments of decency, the unspoken acts of compassion, can echo for years in the hearts of those who receive them. His life wasn't defined by headlines or splashy accomplishments, but by something much more profound, a legacy of love. He helped feed 2 children, without their names even being known to him. And 20 years later, they came back not just to thank him, but to pay him tribute in a way that shook the entire town. All because he did the right thing when nobody else would. And the next time you stand at the crossroads, when you're confronted with the choice to help or walk away, to say kindness or remain silent, remember Rob. Remember the power of one plate of food, one kind smile, one choice to prefer compassion over convenience. You never know who's sitting in your chair. You have no idea what war they are waging, or what door they may walk into, because of something you did. Your smallest action could be someone's lifeline, someone's moment of change, someone's reminder that they are important. At the end of the day, it is not about how much, but how much you care. And when you give with your heart, as Rob did, you might very well change a life, and in the process, discover that yours was richer than you ever dreamed.